The strike was a revolution of the economy of South Africa to benefit all who live in it. It certainly has brought the wage gap into sharp relief once more, with many asking why miners who take on dangerous tasks should live on low wages, while CEOs in air-conditioned offices receive benefits not always seemingly linked to their performance. PwC did a study last year which found that CEOs in South Africa on average are paid 54 times more than the lowest earning worker at their companies. The ratio may be even higher in the mining industry. A fund manager at Old Mutual last year saying that the pay for chief exec officers at mining companies increased 12-fold in the decade to 2012, while dividends per share dropped by 25%. The Public Investment Corporation decided to vote against executive pay at some of the biggest mines last year. Well, to discuss and debate the wage gap, we're joined by remuneration expert Dr. Mark Bussin and from COSATU, Patrick Craven. Good evening to you both, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Mark, if I can start with you, because you've looked at pay for presidents, you've looked at various private sector execs. How does something like this, how do you start calculating it?
There are well-tried and tested international methods of setting executive pay and CEO pay. We take financials into account, like the assets, the turnover, number of employees, other metrics too. And we benchmark with our peers in the industry. So we don't only look at South Africa, we look at international. Then when we set the pay for lower paid workers, it's mostly by negotiation here. We take affordability into account, and that's what gives you that wage, so-called wage gap.
So at the top, it's similar industries across the world. That's the comparison. They're playing on a global playing field.
They're definitely on a global playing field, and internationals come and hunt here because the South African executives are cheap pickings. So internationally, they're very marketable.
Patrick, you've spoken, you've been very outspoken about the wage gap, and I would presume that you think it's unfair from our previous discussions. But what about this consideration that we are talking about individuals who have global options?
It is certainly unfair, and we've been predicting for many years now that it's not simply unfair. It's also potentially what we've described as a ticking time bomb. And I think what's happening in the platinum mines now is some of the bombs starting to explode. But what is particularly interesting, and by pure coincidence, that inequality has now been recognized at the meeting in Davos as a serious global problem. We saw that extraordinary statistic from Oxfam that the richest 85 individuals own the same as the poorest 3.5 billion poor people. That is completely unsustainable. And that's one point that I always make on particularly business programs, that those executives who try to defend the inequalities are not only being selfish and greedy, as I've said, but they're also being very short-sighted, because those levels of poverty are not a way in which any economy can be permanently sustained.
We are talking about individuals, though, who've had to perhaps sacrifice to gain skills. They get to a certain level, there's huge reputational damage and huge responsibility. I mean, the CEO of SAA took a wrong hedging bet on the rand. Huge reputational damage and huge consequences for the company as well. So we're dealing with people who could potentially create or break jobs.
But let's not forget that the rock drill operator in the mine has also developed a very important skill, who works in extremely dangerous conditions, is quite likely to contract a serious life-threatening disease, and works in extremely unpleasant conditions. And we believe that they are the people who really create the wealth. And as your introduction said, very often, the kind of increases that these executives get have nothing to do with their success as a manager, because increasingly these days, the epoch of the individual entrepreneur who by his or her own skills develops the company is a thing of the past. We live in the age of monopoly capitalism, where the companies who make the biggest profits are those who collude with each other to fix prices and to manipulate the market. And
they do make strategic decisions that guide those companies into the future.
But very often the success or failure of that decision has very little bearing on what they claim at the end, because they got a contract that's cleverly worked out to make sure that they're not going to lose their bonuses and perks because of some accidental wrong decision.
Your response to this one?
I'd like to just defend them for a bit. One of the three mining CEOs that we're talking about tonight took a 23% pay cut. Their pay is 23% lower than the previous CEO. One of them has elected, I can't disclose, but it's one of the three. One of them has chosen not to be on the short-term incentive, long-term incentive. For 2 years in a row has turned it down and turned down a pay increase. And one of them, their market pay, so out of the three, their market pay in terms of bonuses is well below the market. So I think not only are the leaders showing some empathy and sympathy, and they are coming to the party in the wage gap debate, and let alone the president of the country, who took a 0% pay increase, and I'd like to point that out, because I think our captains of industry have noticed that and are likely to follow suit, hopefully.
Does that wash with you, Patrick? Is that enough?
No. Obviously there will be many individual business people who can see the problem and are prepared to make a gesture like that. But that in a way isn't the real problem. It's structural inequality. And one or two individuals making a sacrifice like that, and it isn't really much of a sacrifice because they're still earning many, many times more than the workers who create the wealth from which their income comes, don't change the general rule that we're moving towards a society where the rich in general are getting richer and the gap between them and the poor is getting wider rapidly. And that is the problem, which is why simply having individuals who say, well, I personally will make a gesture, is not really going to change the situation at all.
If we try and control this, though, if we introduce regulation around the wage gap specifically, aren't we in danger of seeing companies move abroad? We've already seen people reorientate themselves abroad, potentially taking jobs away from South Africa, taking revenue away from South Africa, and leading to job losses in the future. And isn't that the bigger wage gap between people who earn nothing because they're unemployed and people who at least have a job?
That's why I'm very glad that it's now becoming clear that this is a global problem and you aren't going to solve it on a national basis. Yes, there are workers who earn even less than in South Africa, but that, for a trade union movement, will never be a reason for accepting low pay. It's a reason for trying to build the trade unions in those countries, which, by the way, is happening. All these poor countries are now starting to get organized into wage battles, and our role as a trade union is to support them, not in effect to assist them by accepting that, well, we must take lower wages here, because it leads to what we've called a race to the bottom. Each employer is trying to pay less to their workers than the other one, whether it's in South Africa or somewhere else in the world. And ultimately that increases the wage gap even more.
Patrick, no. Our executives have been taking pay increases far less than the average worker, and that wage gap is not widening. It's definitely closing, and no one has a quibble with paying someone fairly. No one wants to underpay someone, but there's a connection between what you're accountable for, the levels of responsibility, the consequences of error on a global scale versus a site, and that is the risk and the ulcers and the grey hair that one gets.
Mark, can I challenge you on that? Just looking at some figures I found. Nick Holland received a 39% pay rise in 2012. So he's at about 45 million, all included, 9.3 million base salary. 39% pay increase. Anglo Gold executive managers' salaries apparently jumped up by 155% between 2008 and 2012. So the PIC was worried about these incredible jumps for 2 or 3 years.
Can I please make 3 points? The first one is that 1 or 2 swallows don't make a summer. 2, I happen to know some of the reasons why those pay increases were given, and they might have been given because that whole team might have been poached to another country. Now imagine the whole team going. What would have happened to that particular
So you're
organisation.
retaining them, basically?
Yes. And thirdly, I do agree that we need to disentangle skill from luck, and we do have to find better ways of hooking the bonuses and performance-related pay to the performance of the company. But I supervise many theses in South Africa, MBA students and PhD students, and there's a very good correlation between CEO pay, bonuses, and company performance. It's not true that the company performance is going down and CEO pay is going up. So we take 300-400 companies when we do these studies. We can always find one or two here and there, and of course I don't condone that at all, without good reason.
We're running out of time, so I'll give you the last word, Patrick.
Yes, your introduction actually answered the very question we've been discussing. On average, not now talking about individuals, executive pay is going up faster than workers' pay, and there's no sign that that isn't going to continue. And what we want to see, first of all, is the establishment of a national minimum wage. Let's start tackling the problem at the bottom, so that every employer knows that there is a basic standard below which they cannot go. And at least that will tend to stop this race to the bottom problem. And we would like to see that, of course, globally. That's a long-term aim, but ultimately that should be the target.
Very quickly.
Fair enough if it's sustainable and affordable.
All right. Thank you so much, both gentlemen.